Good afternoon. It's fantastic to be with you here in Shanghai. I would have preferred to be with you live, but as the technology seems to be against us, I've recorded this session just to make sure that I'll actually have the chance to talk to you. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Is that working? I think it is. Okay, so my topic today to talk to you is about populism and emotion, and most particularly about how we can research that in language, in discourse, and perhaps also multimodally. So my talk is going to be about these ideas. Maybe the concept of populism is not something that you're very familiar with, but certainly over the last few years, when Donald Trump was in power, for example, and quite a few leaders in Europe and also in other parts of the world, in Asia too, in Latin America, started adopting a new, more aggressive political style. People started talking a lot about populism. So how is populist language discourse different from other types of political discourse? And what is the particular role of emotion in that? And then how can we research those emotions in discourse? So for example, if we have a video or a speech or tweets from a political leader, how can we actually do this systematically? How can we look at the emotions that those things contain? And then I'll show you a few conclusions. Okay, so populism is associated with leaders of this kind. Some of them have now withdrawn a little bit from political life. Berlusconi is now dead. Pablo Iglesias is no longer the head of Podemos. Marine Le Pen is still going strong. Donald Trump, Nigel Farage are still going strong. And so is the political party Vox, for example. So we can think that this is a live phenomenon. It's one that's very interesting, and it really represented a kind of change in the way people were doing politics back around the time 2015, 2020, and still into the present day. So what are populists? Populists claim to speak on behalf of ordinary people. You might say all politicians do this, but what's particularly clear about the populist stance is that they seem to be saying that the ordinary people stand in opposition to an elite establishment which stops them from fulfilling their political ambitions. These principles are combined in different ways with different kinds of populist leaders. So there are some left-wing populists who tend to think of the people versus the elite in economic terms, whereas there are right-wing populists who may exploit that dynamics as well, but also think of the people as being the real people versus outside groups or minorities, so immigrants or foreigners or people from other countries or other nations with whom your nation has a traditional enmity or rivalry. One very good book I recommend on this is Benjamin Moffat's book, The Global Rise of Populism, in which he focuses a lot on the political style and representation of populism and of the people in current political endeavors in 5 continents. So it's very relevant for all of us. Why does populism have a bad name? It's become associated a lot with, I think, right-wing authoritarianism, racism, anti-immigration. It's perceived as socially disruptive. And it's particularly within the actual dynamics of populism that it tends to create a sense of crisis in order to provoke political change. And this can lead to instability. It's perceived as fundamentally divisive because as it works through a dichotomy of people versus elites, people versus minorities, people versus other countries, it creates a kind of social division and unrest. So we might say in language, how is this realized? What is a populist style, and how could this style, how could it be associated with a particular kind of emotion? Do we as linguists and discourse analysts have a contribution that we can make to this discussion? Now, we might argue that when we're talking about politics, there are many different ways we can do that. We can talk about ideologies, about parties, about traditions, different types of democracy, different types of representation. And you can also talk about the micro level. So he said this, actual text that Donald Trump sends in a tweet. This is micro level. What we're trying to do when we do discourse analysis is to link these things that people say in their speeches to the overarching narratives and ideologies that we find there. And so we're somewhere along the line looking at this interface between macro and micro. And how it's associated with emotion, I think what we can say is when we look at the linguistic features, some of those things maybe provoke an emotion like love or anger, and we can say how those feelings of love or anger might link with political structures, political ideologies, and that leads us to the middle. That's where the two things join up. Okay. Before we start talking about this, it's important to say a couple of words about emotion. We all feel emotion, right? But we maybe never thought about what the different components of that are. What psychologists will tell us is that there's a thing called affect. Affect is a kind of an energy, a force that we have inside us, an indeterminate surge of feeling. Whereas our culture and our education tell us that we can interpret those funny feelings that we have as being a specific emotion, as being love, as being anger, as being frustration, right? So through our education, we learn to give our feelings those names. Discourse is the expression of emotion and affect through language and other semiotic systems, and it's the way we externalize or express our emotions through language. An important thing about populism to notice is that populists tend to produce performances that are very similar, whether they're on the right or on the left, Asia, Latin America. There's a sort of pattern to the way they perform their political ideas. Okay, so it tends to go in a 6-stage process. They begin by identifying a failure in what's going on around them. But it's not enough for a populist simply to say something's going wrong. What they like is to link that to other things in order to make it seem as if a crisis is coming up. This is to make people want change, or to make people afraid, or to make people angry. But the idea is to provoke, right? Following on from that, they also have to identify the people responsible for the crisis. So it could be a particular group of immigrants who they regard as causing all the social problems. It could be the elite, the bankers, the party in power, the aristocrats. We think of the French Revolution, those people responsible supposedly for the crisis. In today's world, we can also say that it's very important that populists learn to use media and social media to propagate this performance. They engage with people in new ways. Of course, it's not enough just to be negative and create a crisis. They also have to present a simple solution. For example, the notorious populist Nigel Farage wanted Britain to leave the European Union. And so he presented leaving the European Union as a simple solution. Every problem will be solved if only we do that. It's obvious that this is too simple and it doesn't work like that. But by presenting simple solutions, they give a clear political message to an essentially complex problem. Okay. And then obviously they have to keep their crisis going. It's notorious that when populists actually come into power, it's difficult for them to negotiate a political kind of political stability because they depend so much on the notion of crisis. So what we saw, for example, in Venezuela is that the leaders began to stop using the internal situation in Venezuela as the crisis that they had to solve and create a kind of crisis with other countries that they would continue to have to solve. Okay, so very strongly and very simply, populism and the emotions in populism are associated with us versus them. We love ourselves, we hate the others, we fear the others. And who we are, we know. Who they are, of course, has to be defined and may even change over time in a particular populist message. One interesting way to approach this problem is through the notion of affective discursive practices. These tend to be powerful and polarized messages characterized by strong positive affect for all the people, for the in-group, for ourselves, and a strong negative feeling for the adversaries, either political elites, outgroups, other nations, the enemies of the people. Polarization is the essence of populism. And the sharper the contrast that is established, the stronger the persuasive effect is going to be. Now, we should also note that as we're linguists, we can't take this totally simply, because even if we think of a clear message in language, such as, I feel angry, that's only one of the options. We can express an emotion by saying we feel the emotion, but we can also describe an emotion that we don't feel. So he is making the other people feel angry. And we can provoke emotions. If I say, for example, that, I don't know, French people are always saying they're superior to us, then I'm trying to provoke a feeling of anger or frustration in the people who are listening. Okay, so you have to be careful because it's not exactly the same. Politicians often don't express emotions, but they do provoke emotions. Emotions also tend to be conceptualized rather simply, but there are many different types of emotion. And you can classify them in different ways. So one typical thing is to say good or bad feelings, pleasant or unpleasant. Another way of doing that is to talk about whether or not you feel you control the situation or not. So if you're angry, you feel a sense of control that you can do things. If you're sad, you feel low control, you feel low energy, you can't do things. This is just one of the ways of classifying emotions, but it's actually very important to see how the things fit together, because then you'll find, surprisingly, for example, that anger and pride might easily be close together. Sadness and fear might be close together. And so a politician wanting to provoke fear might also try to make people sad. This is a very interesting thing. This is from the Geneva School of Research on Emotions, up-to-date psychological framework. Obviously, to research emotions in discourse, we have to use tools. So we can do qualitative analysis. That's okay. We can read what people say or listen to what people say and try to analyze it. But there are other tools available. Sentiment analysis software that tends to classify things as positive or negative, or put them into a list of 6 or 8 different emotions. Dictionary-based software that has a larger range of things and offers quite a sophisticated categorization of different emotions mentioned in the text, but obviously it can't read between the lines. It can't say what they're trying to provoke. And then you can also create made-to-measure dictionaries. For example, a colleague of mine has made a dictionary of emotions in Turkish. She can upload that into MaxQda, which is a qualitative analysis program, and it runs also quantitative analyses of the different emotions being mentioned, and she can add annotations. So these are useful things to know. Some examples. In populism, it's very typical that you have to say how wonderful your own country, your own people are. These are 2 examples from the right, UKIP, and from the left, Podemos. So UK's green and pleasant lands, a celebration of how beautiful the United Kingdom is. At the same time, we have the left-wing party, which is celebrating how the working class are the brave and humble people. So we're looking at 2 different ways of being positive about our people. Negative emotions, very typical in populism. Here we have an example from Trump. Sorry, losers and haters, but my IQ is one of the highest and you all know it. Don't feel so stupid or insecure. It's not your fault. He's trying to provoke anger. And it's a funny sort of anger because actually he's talking to his own supporters, showing them that he can make other people angry. He's also trying to make his own supporters afraid, okay, because he's presenting himself as the strong man who has the solution. So he's talking about Mexico and he's saying the immigrants are bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. So the audience, who are Americans, will feel a sense of fear. And then provoking emotions as well. Here, this is interesting. So, for example, the German right-wing party, Alternative für Deutschland, they want to make people resentful. And so they're talking about how a boss in the Volkswagen car production company is earning 3,000 euros a day, even though the colleagues in the factory are worried about being fired. Okay, this is not exactly anger. It's got a bit of anger, but it's a more sophisticated emotion to do with resentment, envy. And in Spain, we also saw that in the left-wing party, Podemos came out of what we call the indignados movement, the indignant people. Again, people who were very angry about various things that went on with property prices, that young people couldn't find homes, that they were being thrown out of their homes, and that there was a very bad situation for young people who were indignant at the way they were being treated. So again, a more sophisticated emotion, and it's being provoked, right, by the populists. Another interesting thing is that populists often don't say they feel angry, but they describe an emotion. So they're saying there's a lot of anger out there. People are angry. Or Donald Trump said, a very big part of the anger we see today in our society. So what they're both doing is taking for granted that anger exists and then legitimizing anger. They're saying people should be angry. It's good that people are angry. We have to deal with their anger. We have to find a solution. So they're actually making this anger that's being described a legitimate thing that has to be responded to by politicians. And you also get this typical polarization. So the people versus the media. The rigged and corrupt media is the enemy of the people. What happens, of course, when you do this again and again and again, as we all know from our own experience, is that if you repeat the same emotions, you end up with a kind of an emotional sympathy group among the people that you are with. So, for example, you can imagine in the university that if all the students feel nervous about their exams, then they somehow infect each other with nervousness about the exams. This happens very typically in political, social situations by repeating the same range of emotions. For example, everything is because the European Union is doing bad things and therefore we feel frustrated. People get into a mindset where they repeat certain emotions and the same language and the same feelings are replicated again and again. This comes to constitute the idea we thought of at the beginning, which is an effective discursive practice, which is taken for granted in a particular culture. Nobody comes to question it anymore. It's just felt that this is necessary. This is the way things are. When we look at, going back to Moffat, when we look at his original 6-stage analysis of how populism works, we can see that there are two things, at least here, where emotion becomes extremely important. To create a crisis, you need to have anger, you need to have bad feeling. And to make the dichotomy between the people and the people responsible, you also need to use language to show the differences between the good people and the bad elite. And of course, when we use social media, we're always using emotions. And so in populism, social media are used to propagate performance. Okay, so a few conclusions. We could say that emotion is a key weapon in the armory of populist politicians. By instrumentalizing emotions, we can actually activate and perpetuate people's fears and desires. And this is done in a culturally specific way. So what makes you angry in China might not be what makes a Swedish person angry. And the way you express emotions may be actually different. It may be less direct, more direct, because emotions are strongly culturally formed. As we found at the beginning, you know, affect feeling is common to everyone, but the way we explain those emotions, the names we give to them, the logical consequences we take from them, those are all part of our culture and they're learned through socialization. So that's why it's an interesting topic to study. As researchers, we can observe the effective discursive practices through which this occurs, and this is a very productive line of study. Here are the 3 key references I would like you to take away from this session. And here are some of my publications about populism, populism in discourse, and emotion and populism in discourse. Thank you very much, and I hope we will meet again.